Welcome to Margin Notes, the podcast where big ideas meet everyday life. Today, we're diving into one of the most mind-bending topics of all, time. We'll explore how your brain predicts the future, remembers the past, and why your sense of now might just be an illusion. From neuroscience to physics, from memory to free will, this one's a trip. Let's get into it.
Welcome to the Deep Dive. We've got a really fascinating topic today, something that feels, well, both incredibly personal and honestly kind of mind-bending.
Oh, yeah.
Yeah, the relationship between your brain and time. We're digging into some sources, mainly the book Your Brain is a Time Machine by Dean Buonomano, a neuroscientist.
Buonomano. Good stuff.
Right. Trying to figure out how this, 3-pound organ inside our heads creates our subjective experience of seconds, minutes, years.
And how it acts like a mental time machine, remembering, predicting.
Exactly. That's the mission, right? To understand the mechanics behind how the brain remembers the past, anticipates the future.
And sort of stitches together this feeling of a continuous present.
Yeah. And what's really wild is seeing how our intuition about time, how it feels, stacks up against, well, the pretty strange reality of time according to physics.
It's profoundly strange. It really is. Reconciling that inner feeling with the objective reality science describes, that's a huge challenge.
Especially with time.
Time is maybe the most striking example of that divide, yeah.
Okay, so let's get into it. The first big idea from the book that jumped out at me was this. The brain, fundamentally, evolved as a prediction machine.
That's the core.
Its main job, over millions of years, was predicting the future based on the past.
Absolutely. Prediction is survival. I mean, every organism does it, from bacteria sensing chemicals to, a deer anticipating a predator.
Right.
And a lot of these predictions, especially the really short-term ones, millisecond, seconds, they're completely automatic.
Right.
Unconscious.
Like catching a ball.
Exactly. Think about how your body just reacts. You instantly calculate the trajectory, the impact, but only if it's something that would bounce, right?
Mm-hmm.
You wouldn't react the same way if, say, a muffin fell off the table.
Right, because you predict it'll just splat. You know it won't bounce.
Your experience tells you that, so prediction is baked right into our reflexes.
And the most basic learning algorithm for this is Pavlov.
Classical conditioning, yeah. Pavlov's dogs are the classic case. Ring a bell, give food, repeat. The brain learns the temporal order. Bell means food is coming.
Or my cat hearing the can opener.
Same thing. That sound predicts food. The brain is wired to think that things happening close together in time must be linked causally. Event A, then event B close after. A must cause B.
Which is exactly why magicians can fool us with timing tricks, like the coin vanish.
Perfect example, temporal misdirection. The magician makes the coin disappear subtly, then does something obvious, like a clap or a flourish.
Huh?
Your brain grabs onto that later, more salient event and wrongly links it to the disappearance, even though the real trick happened earlier. It exploits that close in time means connected assumption.
So prediction is happening constantly. But the brain also seems to, tell time more explicitly. Recognizing patterns, generating rhythms. That's the second core idea.
Yes, exactly. This goes beyond just predicting that something will happen. It's about computing intervals, understanding complex temporal patterns.
Like in speech or music.
Precisely. Think about speech. The length of syllables, the pauses, the rhythm, the prosody that tells you if someone's joking or serious. Or music. The tempo conveys emotion, right? The timing of notes creates the melody. Knowing when is crucial, not just that.
Right, like the bird example. Knowing when to go back to a flower.
Yeah, a pollinating bird needs to track how long it's been since its last visit to know if the nectar has regenerated. It's computing that interval.
And the book emphasizes there isn't just one clock in the brain doing all.
Oh, definitely not. There are different systems, different circuits, handling different time scales.
Okay, so let's maybe dive into those. The longest scale is timing the time of day, the circadian rhythm.
It's the big one, yeah. The 24-hour cycle.
And weirdly, we figured this out partly by watching mice run on wheels.
Huh. Yeah, it sounds a bit strange, but observing those predictable activity patterns in mice and hamsters was actually key. It helped researchers pinpoint the brain's master circadian clock.
Which is the vaguli.
The suprachiasmatic nucleus, or SCN. It's a tiny region deep in the hypothalamus.
And the proof for the SCN being the clock, that experiment sounds wild.
Oh, it is. Pure sci-fi. They took the SCN from a hamster that had a genetic mutation, giving it a 20-hour natural cycle, and they transplanted that SCN into a normal hamster with a 24-hour cycle.
A normal hamster.
It adopted the 20-hour rhythm, its whole sleep-wake cycle shifted. It proved this tiny cluster of neurons, maybe 10,000 of them, controls the body's daily rhythm, partly through hormones.
Wow. And having this internal clock synced up with the environment is a huge advantage, evolutionarily speaking.
Massive. Absolutely critical. There was this elegant experiment with cyanobacteria, basically pond scum. Strains whose internal clocks matched the artificial day-night cycle they were in, just completely outcompeted strains whose clocks were off.
So it's about resonating with the outside world's time.
Even at the cellular level, it involves specific genes, period, clock, cycle, timeless, first found in fruit flies, and light still gets information to the SCN to help synchronize it, even though it's buried deep.
Okay, so that's the daily clock. But that big, slow SCN clock isn't handling the really fast timing, like for speech or music, right? Milliseconds, seconds.
No, it doesn't seem to. Studies show if you mess with the circadian clock, it affects how people estimate hours, but it doesn't really affect their estimates of shorter intervals, like 10 seconds or 2 minutes.
Oh, okay.
And lesion studies in animals also point to different circuits for different time scales. They seem to be separate mechanisms.
And our timing ability on that shorter scale, sub-second stuff, it's incredibly precise.
It really has to be, doesn't it? For language nuance, think about telling grade A from grade A. It's just timing.
Right.
Or catching sarcasm from someone's tone and rhythm. And music, tempo, rhythm, that's fundamental to how music makes us feel.
You also mentioned humor relying on timing.
Oh, absolutely. The setup punchline structure. The punchline has to land just right. Think of that Borat not joke. The humor comes entirely from violating your temporal expectation of where the negation should be.
It's amazing how much information is just in the timing itself.
Morse code is the ultimate example, maybe. No pitch changes like speech or music, just timing. The duration of dots, dashes, pauses, that's the entire code.
And related to this short-term timing, our ability to keep a beat. That seems pretty special.
It does seem quite rare in the animal kingdom. It feels easy, tapping your foot to music, but it's actually a complex predictive act. You're predicting the next beat to synchronize your movement.
And most animals just can't do it.
Most can't. Not reliably. Even primates struggle. You try to train a monkey to tap along, it's surprisingly hard for them.
But there are exceptions, like Snowball the cockatoo.
Snowball, yes, the famous dancing cockatoo. He could genuinely synchronize his movements to music, even adapting if the tempo changed.
So how come we can, and Snowball can, but most others can't?
The leading idea is the vocal learning hypothesis. It suggests that the brain circuitry needed to learn complex vocalizations, like humans learning speech, or songbirds learning songs, or whales their calls, that this circuitry somehow overlaps or provides the foundation for complex rhythmic timing and synchronization. So, humans, some birds, whales, maybe elephants, animals known for vocal learning, seem better at keeping a beat.
Interesting connection. Okay, so the brain predicts, and it times things on different scales. But how does a bunch of neurons actually measure, say, 10 seconds? Is there a little stopwatch circuit?
Well, the evidence points away from a single specialized timer circuit or stopwatch neuron. Instead, timing seems to be something that emerges from the activity within neural circuits. It's an intrinsic property.
An emergent property.
Yeah.
How does that work?
The idea is often called a population clock. It's about the collective state of a group of neurons changing over time.
Okay, like a pattern.
Exactly. Think of ripples spreading in a pond after you throw a stone. The pattern of ripples, their size, their shape, tells you how long ago the stone hit the water.
Right. The state of the system encodes time.
Or imagine lights turning on and off in a skyscraper window in a complex but repeating sequence. If you see the pattern of lights at one moment, you know where you are in that sequence. You know the time.
So different patterns of neural firing represent different moments in time passing.
Precisely. Scientists have actually observed things like this. In rats learning to press a lever after a specific interval, they see neurons in areas like the striatum firing in reliable sequences, creating unique patterns of activity that unfold over the timed interval.
And errors line up with the patterns.
Yeah, fascinatingly. When the rat pressed the lever too early, the neural pattern often looked like it was running fast. If it pressed too late, the pattern looked like it was running slow. The dynamics of the network were the clock.
So the pattern is the timekeeper.
In a sense, yes. Theoretical models, like certain types of neural networks, show how circuits can learn to generate these complex, evolving patterns. Even simple mathematical systems, like a chaos equation where the next state depends predictably on the current state, can create a sequence where the system's value effectively encodes how many steps have passed.
Okay, this is getting complex but really interesting. And it leads us to the third big theme, right? This fundamental clash between how our brain builds time and what physics tells us time is.
Exactly. Our subjective feeling is overwhelming. Time flows. It moves forward from past, through now, into the future.
But physics, especially relativity, paints a very different picture.
It really does. The dominant view in physics, stemming from relativity, is something called eternalism.
Eternalism meaning?
Meaning that the past, the present, and the future are all equally real. They all exist, sort of laid out like locations in space in what's called the block universe. Time doesn't really flow. We just experience our consciousness moving through this block.
As opposed to presentism.
Right. Presentism is the more intuitive idea. Only the present moment is real, the past is gone, the future hasn't happened yet, and time genuinely flows or passes. But eternalists like Jack Smart or Hugh Price argue that flow is a powerful subjective illusion.
And maybe our intuition is so strong that it explains why real time travel, jumping around in this block, wasn't really a thing in fiction until pretty recently.
That seems plausible. H.G. Wells' The Time Machine in the late 19th century was a landmark. Before that, you had stories like Rip Van Winkle, which is more about time dilation or dream journeys, but not hopping into a machine to visit the past or future as if they were real places.
The block universe idea was just too alien.
It seems so. It took a shift in scientific thinking to make it imaginable.
Which came with?
Einstein, primarily. His 1905 theory of special relativity was revolutionary. It showed that time isn't absolute. The rate it passes depends on your speed relative to someone else.
And the train thought experiment illustrates that.
Perfectly. Remember, lightning strikes both ends of a moving train. For someone on the train, midway between the ends, the light reaches them simultaneously. They say the strikes happened at the same time, but for someone standing beside the track watching the train go by, the light from the strike at the back of the train has further to travel to reach them because the train moved forward, while the light from the front strike has less distance. So for the trackside observer, the strikes are not simultaneous, one happens before the other.
So simultaneity itself is relative.
Exactly. And if observers moving relative to each other can't even agree on whether two events happen at the same time, how can there be a single universal now that's the same for everyone? How can time flow uniformly if the order of events depends on who's looking?
And we know this is real. It's been tested.
Oh, yes.
Yeah.
Famously, atomic clocks flown on jets run slower than identical clocks left on the ground by exactly the amount relativity predicts. Time dilation is real. And general relativity, Einstein's theory of gravity, describes space-time being curved. Some solutions even theoretically allow for things like wormholes and time travel under very exotic conditions, which further bolsters the eternalist block universe idea.
But even if physics leans towards this block universe, our feeling of time passing is incredibly strong. And easily distorted, temporal illusions.
They're everywhere. We mentioned Clive Waring feeling perpetually just awake because his amnesia prevents new memories from marking time's passage.
Yeah.
Or just think about how 5 minutes waiting for something important can feel like an hour, while an hour doing something fun flies by. Subjective time constantly stretches and shrinks relative to clock time.
And one of the most dramatic examples is that feeling of time slowing down in a crisis.
Right.
Like a car accident.
People report that frequently seeing events unfold in slow motion during life-threatening moments. There are a few ideas why.
One was the brain speeding up, overclocking.
Yeah, the idea that the brain processes information faster, like running a camera at a higher frame rate. But Buonomano is skeptical. Neurons have physical speed limits. They probably can't suddenly fire, say, 10 times faster. Maybe a small boost, 10-20%, but not dramatic slow motion levels. Plus, the whole fight-or-flight stress response takes time to even kick in.
And stimulants don't really cause it either.
Right. Things like caffeine barely affect basic timing perception. So simple overclocking seems unlikely to be the whole story.
So what else could it be? Memory.
That's the hypermemory hypothesis. The idea is you don't actually perceive the event slower as it happens, but the event is so intense, so emotionally charged that your brain encodes an incredibly rich, detailed memory of it. And later, when you recall that super dense memory, it feels like it must have taken longer to experience. It's an illusion created during recall, not perception. We know memory is reconstructive, especially for emotional stuff.
So the memory feels slow, but the original experience wasn't.
That's a strong possibility. And then there's the meta-illusion idea.
Meta-illusion.
The idea that our subjective feeling of how fast time is flowing is itself a kind of illusion, something the brain constructs, maybe separately from its actual processing speed, like phantom limb pain. You feel it in the missing limb, not just in your brain.
Or the rubber hand illusion tricking the brain about ownership.
Exactly. It suggests the feeling of time speed can be dissociated from the underlying mechanics. The book seems to lean towards a combination of hypermemory and this meta-illusion idea.
But the key takeaway is that these distortions aren't bugs, they might even be features.
Yeah, the brain manipulates subjective time, constantly compressing boring bits, expanding interesting ones. It's part of how we navigate and make sense of experience.
Which connects to another really interesting idea. How we use space to understand time.
Right, the spatialization of time. There's a strong theory that our abstract concept of time is sort of borrowed or co-opted from the brain circuits that originally evolved for navigating physical space.
Because space is more concrete.
More concrete, more ancient, yeah.
Right.
And you see it everywhere in language. We use spatial metaphors constantly.
It's like a long time, a short break. We're looking forward to the weekend. That's all behind us now. Christmas is approaching. We map time onto spatial dimensions.
And this leads to actual confusion sometimes, like that Wednesday meeting example.
Oh, the classic dilemma. If a meeting scheduled for Wednesday is moved forward 2 days, is it now Monday or Friday?
Right, people split on that.
They split almost 50-50. It depends if you adopt an ego-moving perspective. You move through time, so forward is later, Friday, or a time-moving perspective. Time flows past you, so forward is earlier, Monday.
And your recent experience can influence it.
Yeah, studies found people who had just traveled were slightly more likely to take the ego-moving view Friday. It shows how flexible and constructed the spatial mapping of time is.
And physical space can actually warp our perception of time duration too, the kappa effect.
Exactly. If you see two brief flashes of light, the time between them feels longer if the flashes are farther apart spatially.
Why would that happen? One idea is that there might be a shared magnitude system in the brain, maybe in the parietal cortex, that processes quantity, generally spatial size, duration, even number.
So judging a large distance might bias the time judgment.
It could. Processing a large spatial magnitude might bias the associated temporal magnitude upwards, like a kind of cross-modal influence. And other studies show things like brightness, or even just seeing larger numbers can make you perceive a duration as longer.
But this is about brain architecture, not physics, right? It's different from relativity space-time.
Absolutely. Relativity describes a fundamental physical link between space and time. The kappa effect and spatial metaphors reveal how our brain uses its existing spatial processing machinery to understand and represent the more abstract concept of time, likely based on learned associations about how things typically move through space over time.
Okay, so let's shift to maybe the most amazing time machine feature the brain has.
Yeah.
Mental time travel.
Yes, the ability to consciously project ourselves backward into the past to re-experience events, and forward into the future to imagine possibilities. Suddendorf and Corvallis coined the term.
And it's incredibly powerful for us.
Hugely advantageous. It lets us anticipate future problems, plan complex actions, learn from past mistakes in a way most animals can't. Making a tool, planting crops, saving for retirement, it all depends on this capacity.
And we see the link between past and future thought in amnesia cases.
Very clearly. Patients like KC, who lost the ability to recall personal past events, episodic memory, due to hippocampal damage, also couldn't vividly imagine or plan their personal future.
So remembering the past and imagining the future use overlapping brain systems.
It strongly suggests that. Episodic memory seems to provide the raw material, the building blocks for constructing possible future scenarios. It involves a network prefrontal cortex for planning, temporal lobes, including the hippocampus for memory, parietal cortex probably for perspective taking and spatializing time. It's a real team effort.
We're amazing mental time travelers. But then there's the flip side, temporal myopia.
Ah, yes. Our chronic difficulty in prioritizing long-term benefits over immediate gratification.
$100 now versus $120 in a month problem.
Exactly. We overwhelmingly tend to choose the immediate reward, even if it's smaller. This discounting of future value likely has deep evolutionary roots.
Because the future was so uncertain?
Pretty much. For most of evolutionary history, survival day-to-day was paramount. A bird in the hand was genuinely better. But now that bias causes problems. Personal debt, unhealthy habits, difficulty tackling long-term societal issues.
But the bias isn't fixed, right? It changes if both rewards are in the future.
That's the interesting part. Offer $100 in 1 month versus $120 in 2 months, and suddenly people are much more patient. The $20 difference looks more appealing. It's really the powerful lure of right now that drives the most extreme myopia.
And this is exploited all the time.
Constantly. Credit cards create a buffer between the pleasure of buying and the pain of paying. Loyalty programs offer immediate small rewards that obscure future costs or commitments.
It really feels like a central human tension. This amazing foresight capability alongside this persistent short-sightedness.
It is. Our ability to plan built civilizations, but our myopia threatens to undermine them through things like climate inaction or unsustainable debt.
Is there hope? Can we overcome it?
Well, the hopeful note is that it's not entirely hardwired. The balance can be shifted. It takes conscious effort, practice, education, deliberation, and actively engaging that mental time travel ability. Really visualizing the future consequences of choices can help counteract the pull of the present.
Okay, so bringing all these threads together, the brain's construction of time, the physics view, the illusions, the future planning, leads to maybe the biggest philosophical question hanging over all this: free will.
Right. If physics leans towards eternalism, a block universe where past, present, and future all exist, what does that mean for our feeling that we freely choose our actions?
Does it mean our choices are already written?
That's the implication for many. If the universe is deterministic, one state fully predicts the next, the future is fixed anyway. But even without strict determinism, in a block universe, all moments and events already are part of the structure. Your choices are just features of that structure.
So is free will just a feeling, an illusion that comes after the brain has already decided?
That's a prominent view going back centuries to philosophers like Hume and Huxley, and argued more recently by neuroscientists and psychologists like Daniel Wagner. He called the feeling of conscious will an epiphenomenon, maybe even just a feeling the brain generates to explain its own actions to itself.
And there's brain research supporting this, predicting choices before awareness.
Some studies show brain activity related to a decision building up hundreds of milliseconds, sometimes even seconds, before the person reports consciously deciding or feeling the urge to act. It suggests the conscious feeling of willing might be one of the last steps, not the first.
The brain decides, then tells consciousness, you did that.
That's one way to interpret it. But even if the feeling of free will is an after-the-fact construction, it doesn't necessarily mean it's useless or pointless.
How so?
Think about pain. The feeling of pain from touching a hot stove happens after the tissue damage, but it's crucial for learning not to do it again. Similarly, the feeling of having willed an action and observing its consequences might be essential for learning, motivation, and planning future behavior. Evolutionarily, the feeling of agency might be primarily future-oriented, helping us adjust our future actions based on past choices.
Wow. Okay, so let's recap this deep dive.
Yeah.
We went from the brain as a basic prediction machine,
Through its complex ways of telling time, from circadian rhythms down to milliseconds.
then collided with the weirdness of time and physics, relativity, the block universe.
Explored our own temporal illusions, like the slow motion effect.
Saw how we map time onto space in our minds and language.
Discussed our incredible ability for mental time travel, but also our frustrating temporal myopia.
And landed on these huge questions about free will and consciousness in a potentially timeless universe.
It really paints a picture of our subjective experience of time as this incredibly sophisticated, vital construct of the brain, but possibly, as Einstein suggested, a stubbornly persistent illusion when viewed against the backdrop of physics.
An illusion that, paradoxically, lets us navigate, predict, plan, and shape our world.
Absolutely. And understanding the mechanisms, the biases like temporal myopia, the way our brain constructs this experience, maybe that can help us make slightly better decisions, especially about the future.
It definitely leaves you thinking. Here's a final thought. If our sense of time, something so fundamental, is this constructed and potentially illusory thing, what does that imply about other subjective experiences we take for granted?
Right. And how does that uniquely human capacity for mental time travel, the engine of so much progress, also manage to fuel some of our biggest collective challenges? Something to chew on.
Thanks for tuning in to Margin Notes. If this episode bent your brain in a good way, leave us a like, subscribe, and share it with someone who loves deep ideas. Got thoughts? Questions? We'd love to hear them in the comments. Until next time, stay curious and keep thinking.